My name's Hunter Bidwell. I'm a mining safety graduate student here, so first year here. Today, we're actually going to be talking about patterns of heat strain among a sample of U.S. underground miners. And the background of this is I want to set the global stage is that with the demand for critical minerals, we're exceeding that demand, and we're having to expand mines underground much farther. And so in the study that I'm presenting today, the deepest part of this mine is 5,200 feet below the surface. And also another good example of the picture you see right here is the Resolution copper mine in Superior, Arizona. The deepest part of this mine is 7,000 feet below the surface, and air temperatures can get up to 170 degrees. It's hot. And so that, because it's why it's so hot is because all the geothermal is coming up from either the mantle or the inner core of the earth, right? And so that presents a new type of hazard in the mining industry. And so what the background of this study is that they're basing it off of ACGIH standards. And if you do not know what that is, that's the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. They set a standard in place that core temperatures amongst workers should exceed 38 degrees Celsius, which is 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The purpose of this is they want to have a new heat, I would say a heat exceedance in there, so we could not expose workers to heat as much. But also we need to take into factor is that like MSHA, the regulatory agency in the United States, which is the Safety and Health Administration, does not have a heat stress or heat injury prevention plan in place. So they have to go on as subgroups to look for the standards. So the methods of this study is that they took 6 participants underground mining in a mine. They monitored them for about 6 months. They tracked them on their key acclimations, how much have they been working in the industry. They tested them on even dehydration levels and stuff like that, health as well. And then they stuck it out over 3 different shift testing, right? Non-consecutive days per week. They measured core temperatures with thermal pills, and I'll describe that next slide. They used wet bulb flow temperature monitoring devices. If you don't know what that is, that takes in humidity temperature, dry temperature, and radiant temperature, and then they average that out into a feel-like temperature. So if you were to step outside and it says a certain degree temperature one day, that's not the feel-like temperature. That's probably just the air temperature index. And these are what the devices look like, what they use. Up on the top left corner, you can see the thermal pills. So what they would do is they would connect these to a device called an external recorder, and they would clip it mostly on their belt line, and they would have the miner ingest the pill, and they would wait about an hour until it hits their digestive tract. And then it would start taking core measurement readings about every 20 seconds through the whole shift. And they did that every time for 3 different shifts, about 6 miners. And then they also did heart rate monitor chest straps just to keep track of their heart rates. And they just use like the classic, like athlete, heart monitors. They stick around your chest. And then the devices on the right are widgets, and that would measure the heat, the widget readings. In the top right corner, that's the heat stress tracker. And it's, I don't know what I'll say about that big. And the purpose of why they did a smaller one is that when you have many different miners working in an underground setting and they're constantly moving through a huge mine, it's almost impossible to keep track of where they're going. And they're constant movement. So in the study, they actually adhered those to their helmets. I like to think they just put Velcro on or duct tape on there. And then they read environmental readings with widget monitor on the bottom right when it's the gold standard for industrial hygiene. Is the Quest Stamp 46. And that one is they usually stick up on tripods, and they take an environmental over one set of locations. And they did that for miners that are working in a particular area for a long period of time. So the measurements that were taken in this study they separated them into 4 different zones. It was basically normal temperature, warmer, hot, and then extremely hot. And this is based off their core temperature. And as you can tell, it's 37.5, 37 to 38, 38, 38.5. And then they took heart rate average over 3-minute interval periods because some of the data would get lost quite a bit. And it was really hard to correlate core temperatures with like heart rate monitors and midget readings. So they average it out into 3-minute intervals. So what are the results? I like to ask you guys, what are you seeing with the results up here? Because I've looked at it from, I would say, a safety professional standpoint, and I would like you guys to look at the stat standpoint as well. Just imagine yourself, you're on the job site as a safety professional. What do you see when you see these readings? Because I'm seeing, if I don't want my workers to exceed 38 degrees core temperature, I'm focusing mostly on zone 2, 3, and 4. It's particularly zone 3 and 4. As you can tell, each miner was exceeding that average. Each miner was exceeding that threshold. So they were reaching that 38 degree core temperature. And these are the temperature patterns that they monitored with thermal pills. These are the average timed change zones. So each zone they change on average per miner with core temperature on the left side. And on the right side, you can tell with proportion and time sent each time zone. I look at that chart and I can see every miner is exceeding that 38 degree temperature. Especially I would be focusing on number miner 5, 3, and 2. And I would look at that and say, what type of long-term effect does that have on the worker? Because the average worker in this study has worked at this mine for 9 years. So what does that add up over time? Now this is where kind of the data kind of gets a little, I would say, fuzzy a little bit with heart rate on the left, and then they took widget readings and compared it to each time or each temperature zone and each participant. And there's some readings in there that kind of stood out for me. For example, in the heart rate monitor, or this is the heart rate. They had a lower heart rate, but their core temperature was quite high. So why is that? I got 3 different theories in my head right now, and we'll get to that when we get to the discussion. I want to see if you guys can actually answer this question. And then on the right side as well, you can see some of the widget reading temperatures. You'll see 60 degrees, mostly in the 80 degree range. I'm up into the hundreds. It's way up. And I can tell you why that's going to be more lower. And that can be of many reason factors, because I've actually done heat surveying monitoring in certain locations with widget readings. And you might have an air temperature, which is basically if I took a thermometer and I stuck it on the wall, that's your air temperature. I've had air temperature readings up to 120 degrees survey sampling in some locations, and then I'll have a humidity temperature that's 74 degrees. Or I'll have a radiant temperature, which is, I like to tell people, it's radiating off of surface. So like think of like a stove, heat stuff off. It could be 150 degrees. That temperature, widget temperature reading, might bump it down to like 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So when I look over at like participant 4 that has that high core temperature, and he's working in, what was it, 58 degrees widget reading, is that air temperature or radiant temperature a lot higher, or humidity temperature a lot higher? Or is his work quite a lot higher? And they didn't factor that in. So the interpretation of this data, from my perspective, it heat exposure in mines is a reoccurrent episode, and it just fluctuates over time. So is working in these environments for short time, for a long time, for a long time, will impede health risks as well. But it also suggests that there is a need for adaptive cooling systems or new administration or hierarchy control systems. I asked ChatGPT what the discussion was. I was actually very disappointed, quite disappointed actually, with some of the questions that came up, like how might results differ in surface mining and other industries? And I was like, I think the results would differ quite differently, because when you're measuring with heat, every industry is going to fluctuate differently. And that's how you, as safety professionals, or if you're on the job, you have to account for what type of situation you're in. You have to adjust to that situation. I thought that was weird. But for occupational health practices, it does bring forth a need for continuous temperature monitoring. What I'm quite fascinated with is that can we make a device where we can not have these workers ingest pills every pop, right? I mean, they're like $45 a piece. You can't afford those. Giving out to workers, hand them out like a pharmacist handing out Percocets that people have kidney stones. But it also supports the ACGIH limit standard too, that there's fields that they do get that hot. And it does inform that there needs to be a better heat injury programs to be put in place so that each worker does not get exposed at internal physiological effects. Now, this is where I like to get the discussion and get your thoughts of why some of these workers are having such high core temperatures in lower widget readings. Now, this is where
Oh, sorry, I'll leave it to the group. But I'd assume that metabolic rate, which is impacted by like your work type of work they're doing. So
Yeah.
what kind of, is it heavy work? Is it light work? So the heavier the work, the more heat you're going to generate internally.
So we'll call that workload.
Okay.
So we have workload. What else can be the factor? Just think like you're outside and you're working really hot climate. What?
Temperature and humidity.
That might. This is the thing. We're looking at temperature and humidity already, but we have core temperatures really high in some of these locations. So, especially with participant 4, participant 1, 3. So we have temperatures. I mean, if you're working outside on a job site, what type of clothing?
As thin as I can get it.
Well, exactly. But some of these workers might be working in a hazardous situation where they have to wear super heavy protective clothing that generates a lot. So we can say clothing. And as I read through the study, this is where, as a safety professional or industrial hygienist, I'm actually quite disappointed with it, is that they didn't factor that in. What they did is just basically send them out into a work environment and said, okay, this is your core temperature readings, and they tracked them through the whole mine, but they didn't factor in. Also, one other thing that's very important if you're sampling workers on the job site, and it can include dust monitoring, noise sampling, and that's okay. Right? So if you're not factoring location, how can you tell where these workers are being exposed to heat the most? So I would have said that's where I'm actually really quite disappointed the most, because if you're in an underground setting, I'm pretty sure mine temperature is going to stay stagnant or same in some locations. It's not going to change over time or depending on the season, especially if you go deeper underground. That was my thoughts with me. Said like, that's right. Does anybody have any other thoughts? Are we looking for time?
We got plenty of time, so can hopefully have some input for discussion.
Hey, Hunter,
Yes.
just a quick question. In the study, I haven't necessarily had a chance to look too much at it, but have you seen, or was there any mention as far as the direct or indirect impacts to occupational disease or disorders that they'd identified as a problem because of, I mean, there've been cases of
Yes.
heat stress.
Yeah, in the results section, they did track the miners over the 3 shifts, and it was something like 67% of the workers. It had one symptom of heat strain illnesses. That's when that factors in, like, let's say heat rash. Heat stroke is going to be the severe one. Injuries like that. 67% of them did have one symptom of that. And then it jumped to like 51% experienced 2 of those symptoms, and then 27% experienced 3 symptoms over the shift. Which I do look at it as a serious problem for safety professionals, because that can also lead to other accidents on the job site.
I don't know if I didn't catch it, but did they mention thinking about, I know you mentioned they didn't include it in the model, but potential like acclimatation, or however you say that, acclimatation, I can't say it, acclimation.
Acclimation.
Did they talk about that at all? And if the workers that had been there for long enough had potentially acclimated to their climate, or I'm sure they probably didn't based off what you talked about, but any thoughts on that?
What they did in the study, when I read it, is that when they did the first and like a sampling of these workers to make sure that they're healthy and they're acclimated, is that in that first 6-month period they watched for acclimation to make sure that they were used to that temperatures. And then I also would like to point out that this is just a short prevalence data. Yeah, this is a period point prevalence that we're conducting on this study. These workers might be working completely somewhere else next week and being exposed somewhere else.
When it comes to like the inclusion criteria for participants, did they do anything beforehand to see like, and I don't really know a ton about this, so this is just like a thought, and if I'm wrong, you can tell me. But like, is it true that some people have like a different body temperature to start with?
Yes.
And so could that be affecting outcomes? And I think of like, and I don't know if like the study included women, but like generally women have a really high fluctuating basal temperature, right? It changes daily depending on like all sorts of things. And so I think that just might be good to consider. And I don't know if they talked about that at all.
In the study, they didn't mention gender, so I'm guessing the participants were they worked in all different jobs, but they did mention that the standard core temperature, actually I don't want to, can't find it, but I got it right. MDs, please, chime in if I get this one. Is it something like 28 degrees Celsius to 32 degrees Celsius? It's like that 96 to 98 degree range. That's going to be temperature. Does that sound about right?
Sounds right to me.
Yeah. They did put that in there. But they're taking this and they're considering these healthy workers. But there's also factors we got to understand, is that everybody is susceptible in their way to these type of environments. You have to adjust for each person if you're working in a situation like this.
Hey Hunter, I'm gonna have you turn off the mic. It's going in and out. So just turn off the mic and project as loud as you can.
No problem for me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Going along with the exclusion criteria, do you know if they purposely excluded people who had already had like heat stroke or had a history of heat illness?
They did say most of the workers did have some sort of symptom in the previous pass, but I didn't read anything that excluded workers.
Okay.
They just found the 6 participants and I'm sure they just wanted to participate in the study.
So based off of these findings, and the fact that they do have to wear like heavier clothing in order to protect themselves, what would your recommendation be for them?
Well, the most important thing that to deal with heat is gonna be engineering factors. And this takes us back to the hierarchy of controls in a safety setting. And that's gonna be it's gonna be through ventilation and HVAC systems. How are we gonna pump cool air down into the mines so workers can get out of the heat? That's the best thing we have right now. There's other like PPE factors like cooling vests as well. Some have like, you can bring an ash check, like a pack at chest with you and it blows constant cool air with you, but then you have to carry that thing around. But then there's other ice packs that have cooling vests that you have to stick ice packs in them. But if it's so hot in an environment, they melt in like 15 minutes and you're lugging around water. And then, of course, administration factors is constantly switching out workers in different locations and make sure they're not staying in one location and being exposed over time. I would definitely say ventilation for some of folks.
Do you know if there's anything in place to ensure that workers stay hydrated while they're down there?
That is an also recommendation with MSHA when they do heat injuries or heat recommendations for high work environments and that they have, depending on workers should drink so many fluid ounces per hour. And I can't pull those numbers off the top of my head because there's a lot of numbers. But yes, they do have those in place. And you can either that but you have to transfer the water down into the mine. And that's where each location is. They didn't mention any of that. They did mention about though, they did sample for each worker on how dehydrated they were. And it was something like 60% of them were showing up to the job dehydrated, like a little dehydrated, and then after the job, it actually kind of dropped a little bit. So I figured throughout the shift they were getting rehydrated, but then if they worked longer periods of time, then that dehydration.
This might be a dumb question, but for someone who doesn't really know this field too much, when they're experiencing high temperatures and stuff like that, and they're like probably like sweating a lot, getting dehydrated and that, do companies have like measures in place for them to be constantly trying to be hydrated or like have like products for them to be constantly taking to keep them
Yes.
good? Okay.
No, it depends on the company, but
Okay.
each company, if you're working on I would say a safety, really good safety climate zone, they would have those.
Measures to take care of them?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Cool.
And then I might be talking, Kyle, you might have to chime in on this one. If there is policy set into place with a company and they're not following those policies, can MSHA hit them with fines and stuff?
Typically, I mean, there's like almost like an equivalent of the general duty clause that I've seen MSHA
Yes.
inspectors go to that have cited for that. Mostly though, I've seen it mostly around like negligence and extreme cases. For example, like in an underground setting, is there ease of access to cool water?
Yep.
Do you have to have cooling stations available depending on ambient or radiant heat rate generation that's happening? Another thing is just kind of an interesting side note. I was down in Nicaragua in March. This was a different company and they were doing some work and they had lots of geothermal activity. And it was so extreme that they were having cases of kidney disease from chronic dehydration. So that's another consideration long-term is you get dehydration over the course of not just one shift, but continuously. It's really hard on your kidneys. So they had lots of people with kidney stones, but then they also had chronic kidney disease in the workforce.
That's been observed with sugarcane workers through the University of Colorado group. as well, kidney disease due to, well, they think associated with dehydration and extreme heat.
And it wouldn't surprise me, OSHA is actually in the middle of, they're setting up, regulatory followings that we have to put heat and injury prevention programs into the workforce. I bet you MSHA is gonna be following that too, or they're in the midst of talking. With the expansion of these underground mines going deeper and deeper and hotter, it's bound to come up. It's kind of a new topic they're focusing on, I would say.
Yeah, the study is almost like a pilot study. They're saying that they want to, dip their toe into this research to potentially guide future research. Given your concerns with the things that they did not, account for, the confounders, do you think that they accomplished their aim? Like, do you think there's enough good in here that to guide future research, or what do you think?
I think there's actually enough, just based on the readings that you have, workers just reaching that exceedance of really high core temperatures. There is stuff definitely that we can do more research in and try to come up with better ways to monitor heat and injury preventions. But when it comes to this study, I'm actually quite disappointed, because if you're an industrial hygienist or safety professional on the job, you want to know exactly where these people are at, what type of workload is going on, so that you can factor those in.
Anything else for Hunter? All right, great job.
Sam's mic almost appears.
Yeah, sounds good. I can project.
Hey, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Spencer. I am an occupational health psychology master's student. This is my first year here at the center. I'm really enjoying it so far. Thank you for coming to Journal Club today. I'm going to be presenting about self-determination at work and understanding the role of leader membership exchange. And I want to start out, I'll give a little bit of background, but one, I picked this study because it's interesting to me. But two, I also picked it because the people that are here, you are most likely either a leader right now or potentially going to become an influential leader in the future. And so I think it's really important that we recognize the impact that leaders can have on their workers. And so that was kind of why I picked it. It is very psychological, principle heavy. And so I'm going to do my best to explain some of the more niche items to you guys. But to start out, the authors stated that their purpose was to explore the role of the leader in facilitating employee self-determination. They focused on two models. So the first was self-determination theory, which states that humans have three specific psychological needs. Those needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy is the feeling of having choice, making choices for yourself. In the workplace, that can also mean owning the choices that are made for you. So even if you don't necessarily make the choice, you own up to it and you do good with it. Competence is feeling either capable and effective in your job, and then relatedness is having close relationships to others. The other framework that they focus a lot on is the leader membership exchange. I'm going to do my best. I'm somebody that hates acronyms, so I'm going to try and say them. That way you guys aren't trying to remember what acronym I talked about 5 minutes ago. So leader membership exchange focuses on the quality between an employer or a leader and their employees. And an example of these might be somebody with high LMX or a high LMX relationship, leader membership exchange, is going to be somebody that's very trusting. There's a lot of trust in the relationship. There's a lot of support, potentially mutual respect, things of that nature. And then an example of a leader membership exchange that's lower, not necessarily most high quality, is going to be very transactional, potentially impersonal, and very like task focused. So kind of put your head down, get the work done, don't tell me about your problems, kind of type of stuff. And some other very important definitions that you'll see in the model here in just a moment are autonomous motivation, which once again is kind of a sense of choice and action. For this study, the authors used that being a combination of identified and intrinsic motivation. Identified motivation, the definition there is that it's value driven, so the person doesn't necessarily want to be doing what they're doing, but they recognize that it is good or has value, so they do it anyways. And then intrinsic motivation is the person or individual experiences joy or satisfaction in doing it, so that's the drive behind there. Subjective vitality is a sense of energy or liveliness at work. We have job satisfaction, which is your emotional feelings about your job, as well as effective organizational commitment. And that is just your emotional connection and commitment to the organization that you are working at. The reason I took the time to explain those is the model gets a little bit complex. So you'll see it definitely flows here from left to right. So what we're going to be looking at is the leader membership exchange and how it affects those self-deterministic needs that we have. Those needs will then impact an individual's autonomous motivation, and then that motivation is going to impact some of these outcomes of vitality, job satisfaction, and effective commitment. Part of the reason why I wanted to show this too, I threw some of the introduction into ChatGPT and asked it to build me a model for this paper. That is what it came up with. So Chat tried really hard, and it is kind of a complex model. They got a lot of the elements, but definitely not phenomenal. I will say I have some other AI in here later, and I do think that AI can do awesome things for us, but this was maybe not the best example of its capabilities. So for the study, there was 283 participants. So these were either alumni or current graduate students. The average age was 43 years old, 53% male, and 54% male, and 93% white. It was a cross-sectional study, and they did use self-report, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's really common with a lot of psychological measures to have self-report, which can be a strength and a weakness. And then the measures are just for all of those things I've mentioned that are in the model. The paper goes into a lot more specifics on some of the different measures and the reasons behind using them, but I didn't feel it was appropriate to talk about it. So here we have some of our descriptive statistics and a correlation matrix of our variables. Any absolute value greater than 0.12 was considered significant, which means there is a lot of significance going on in this model, which isn't super unexpected because these concepts are heavily related to one another. And the actual model itself is a little bit more complex than just these base correlations. So I had never heard of this before, which isn't surprising, but they used structural equation modeling, or SEM. I will probably refer to this as SEM for the rest of the presentation because it's really long. But so SEM is a multivariate technique that tests complex relationships among multiple variables simultaneously. So what does that mean? Well, I really like this photo that I put on there because you can see there's kind of this like web or network. And the equation modeling, it's all done within a statistical software, is able to kind of combine some of what are called latent variables, so things like motivation that are a little bit harder to conceptualize and measure. And it will actually create a single construct from it, so it kind of pulls these things out. And then with SEM, they do a lot of different model fits because they want to make sure that the model that they're using is good. So for the comparative fit index, that shows how well the data is fitting the model compared to like a worst case scenario. Anything above a 0.9 is generally considered to be a good fit. So we checked that off, and then the standardized root mean square is going to be measuring the average difference between the perceived and then the outcome of some of the different variables. Once again, this is the opposite, so you're looking for low numbers there, and anything below 0.8 is considered good. So once again, pretty good fit. And then chi-square, pretty much with any large sample, you're gonna have a significant chi-square for determining fit, and so that's not unexpected here. But I just said a lot of big words. I know not all of us are stats people, and I personally like a little bit more stimulation when I'm receiving information. So I asked a free AI generative tool to give us a real knockout definition or example of SEM. And this is what it came up with.
Enabled the authors to rigorously test how leader relationships influence motivation and outcomes through need satisfaction, revealing a cohesive and statistically strong
I
model.
don't know about you guys, but I get it now, right? Not really, but
That's your voice, right?
that is me, actually, no, it's not. So really quick, I do want to mention, we're around Halloween. I picked the horror option, which was free. I don't know if that's why the people's faces look that way, or if it was just bad AI generation.
So what's so scary about a British voice?
I don't know, but on a more serious note, I wanted to do this because this was done in about 1 minute with a free AI tool, which I think is, I mean, don't get me wrong, not great, right? But AI has the opportunity to be utilized in teaching and in leadership and in all of our occupation. I think it's really interesting. We might need to stretch our minds a little bit right now with free AI tools because they don't give us the best results, but a lot of the stuff that's behind paywalls can do some really cool stuff. So don't discount it in the future. That was partially for me to be able to relax for 5 seconds during this, but also just to show that AI can potentially be an effective way, maybe not in like the TikTok format, but I thought it was pretty interesting. Getting back into the model a little bit, once again, there's a lot of numbers here. And I'm not going to try and stand up here and tell you exactly what they mean because it's very complex when you get into SEM. The most important thing, however, is just right here. So you'll notice that is the hypothesized model. And there's some values missing there on the right-hand side because these models are being compared to the hypothesized model. So what that means is because all of those numbers there on the right-hand side are statistically significant and they are positive, that means that they are all worse fits than the model. So once again, this is just a check showing that the model does have a good fit for the data. These were the results. So they had 3 different hypotheses. Each hypothesis had 3 subset sections. You'll notice that there is only one that is not significant. I'll talk about that in a second, but you'll see there is a beta value there. So that is a standardized beta. And what that is showing is the expected change in our outcome based on a 1 standard deviation increase of our predictor. So what that means for hypothesis 1A, so the leader membership exchange, as that increased by 1 standard deviation, we would expect our competency to increase by about 0.55 standard deviations. And a little bit of background there. A standardized beta of greater than 0.5 is generally considered a large effect, and you'll see that there are, most of them are large effects. One thing I did want to note is that relatedness as its effect on autonomous motivation was not significant. I was taught that finding things that are not significant doesn't mean that they're bad, and so for me, I was really bummed because the article only provided that n.s, meaning non-significant. I personally think it's valuable to have those numbers there, so we can talk about that a little bit later. And SEM, with the output that comes out of the statistical modeling, might not provide non-significant p-values. I don't really know how that works, but I did want to know that. I did think in terms of quality of the study, this was actually a pretty high quality study. I would say it was kind of difficult to find things that were wrong with it, but that was one that stuck out to me. So this is kind of meaning back to our model. Once again, it's a little complex, but so each of those statistically significant numbers you'll see, those are the betas that we just saw. So as you progress from one of these to the next, you can see that expected change. I do want to be very careful about our interpretation of that. We'll talk about that in a moment. But just some things to notice. So the leader membership exchange has significant effects on those self-deterministic needs like we had talked about. Those needs, except for relatedness, do impact autonomous motivation And then autonomous motivation had significant effects as well. One thing I thought was really interesting was that leader membership exchange, you'll notice that 0.14. So there is a significant relationship between leader membership exchange and job satisfaction, which a careful interpretation of that would mean if you have a happy work-life balance with your boss, you're probably gonna like your job a little more. And then with relatedness, it did not impact the individual's feeling of choosing, but it did impact the level of emotional commitment that they had to their organization. In essence, once again, a modest interpretation could be if you have a sense of belonging with your work and with the people that are your coworkers and potentially leaders, you may feel more of a desire to have that emotional commitment towards them and an extension of them, the organization as a whole. So this is the discussion from the article itself. The first thing, kind of like I mentioned, so high quality leader membership exchange fulfills those self-deterministic needs of the employee. Those needs, excluding relatedness, then are key drivers for an individual's autonomous motivation. Relatedness was not, like I mentioned, but it still did have some significant impact. And then autonomous motivation, which that feeling of choosing and self enhance those outcomes of satisfaction, commitment, and vitality. So I want to be very careful when I say this. I'm going to put an image up on the board, but what we're looking at is almost a relationship kind of like this. So we're talking about how the leader membership exchange, so that quality of relationship, is going to impact some of our needs. Our needs are then going to impact the way that we feel that we get to choose how we work, and then that will affect our feelings towards work. I say that we have to be very careful because this is a cross-sectional study. So there is no demonstration of temporality. So the authors, the way that they pose these hypotheses in the discussion, it could lead you to believe that if you have a really good leader, they're going to meet your needs, you're going to feel like you have choice at work, and then you're going to have really great work. That is a conclusion that involves temporality, and we do not have temporality. So just be careful there. I do think it's important to recognize that for future research, they discuss this a little bit, but that temporality aspect is really important when we start to look at that cascading or jumping off point effects. Some of the limitations and strengths that they talked about were they had some pretty good theoretical modeling. They had a pretty rigorous analysis with that SEM analysis, and then they had some really good practical implications in the article, I thought, as well. I personally didn't feel like they stretched or reached too far. I felt like they were pretty basic and good principles that could be applied in any of our occupations. And then limitations, like I mentioned, it was cross-sectional, so we cannot infer causality. However, I will just make a slight note. In psychology, causality is kind of just this distant thing that we'll never like really reach. It's great and it's good, and we can have awesome correlations and things of that nature, but as of right now, can't look at causality. It was self-report data. Any of you that have worked with self-report data, or if you have not, you will hopefully in the future. There can be some issues with that. I feel like I've seen all sorts of stuff, but a lot of times you'll just get people putting some really funky stuff in there, especially if you're doing like college age people. But so that can be a potential issue. And then it's a very homogeneous sample, right? So it's very much white professional people. And so there could be some differences in those relationships if they had a more diverse sample. For future research and then some of their implications, the authors talked about training in autonomy and supportive behavior to seek building strong connections between leaders and their employees, and then to encourage feedback and employee input, which I really liked. I think that's something that is becoming more trendy, but is really important in these kinds of relationships. And then for future research, like I mentioned before, they really need to do some form of longitudinal study to be able to assess temporality, and then potentially going across cultures, as well as doing some more performance measures to understand how it is impacting the employees. Thank you guys for being here. I would love to hear your thoughts and questions that you have. I do have some hidden questions if we can't come up with any, but thanks for your time.
I've got one. So how could you determine causality in a study between LMX and say one of the outcomes, like employees' perceived autonomy or job satisfaction?
A really good question. I think I would start out by narrowing it down. So picking your variables, you would definitely need to have the backup of literature. So you would want to have a very thorough literature review and then particularly measuring between different time points. So if you were to implement, let's say, an intervention or something, you would be able to see change in that relationship. And if you did a study in that manner, you would be able to demonstrate that something that you are influencing caused a change, or well, be careful there, but influence that
But
change.
you can say cause if you do an experiment.
Okay, okay.
So intervention there was the key. So if you did an experimental intervention trial, you can conclude that what you did caused the outcomes, but you probably would have to demonstrate that your intervention improved LMX from baseline to intervention. And then there is some inference, but an experimental design can help you get closer to causality plus the longitudinal.
Other thoughts and questions? Yes.
One question I had, did they give any information on the roles that the individuals in the study held with like what their job positions were, whether they were in leadership positions or?
Yes, that's a really good question. They gave a breakdown of where they were working, so private, government, those like the atmosphere, you could say, but I don't believe they captured what the individual was doing for their actual job. And I do think that that could definitely impact their perceptions of some of these relationships as well as how they play out. So a very good point. They could in the future focus more on the actual jobs of the individuals. All right, we'll go to one of my fun questions. Okay, so like I kind of talked about at the beginning, I know this is a pretty dense psych type study. How do you guys think these findings could relate to you in your career path when it comes to being a leader and potentially having a change for good on some of your employees? All right, we'll go back over there.
I think if you end up in a leadership position, this kind of shows that, you know, assuming causality or that at least there's a relationship between like making your people that you lead feel like important and feel like people and not workers has a lot of really positive outcomes in general.
I think it's also important to recognize too that I think sometimes we think of leadership in terms of like, oh, I got a really nice job that gives me a lot of money, but there's a lot of opportunity for you to lead. Even right now, I think of some of the different TAs or some of the different students that are around me that have been in the center longer than I have. And I would say in a lot of ways, they're leaders to us and they have an opportunity to impact and influence us. And at some point, that'll be us, you know, the younger people will be the ones that have been here longer and have opportunities to influence people. And so it doesn't just have to be, I know this was a work setting, but it doesn't just have to be work settings.
So a comment on that note, I always like to look at the original scale items because the concept is the quality of the relationship between the leader and the member. But two really interesting questions on the scale are, regardless of how much formal authority your leader has built into his or her position, what are the chances your leader would use his or her power to help you solve problems in your work? And then another one is, again, regardless of how much formal authority they have, what are the chances he or she would bail you out at his or her expense? So those kinds of questions are like, this person is really there for you. Like when the going gets tough, they're going to bail you out. They're going to use their power to help you out. And so those are the kinds of, if you see the scale and you know it's related to good things, those are kinds of behaviors or traits you can cultivate in yourself as a future leader. So yeah, it's more than the concept. If you can drill down to the scale, you can sometimes see what are the behaviors they're asking about, and then you can work on those yourself.
Yeah, Maggie.
I'm kind of curious as well, like if they said anything about the role that the member themselves plays and like their kind of behaviors and things that contribute to that relationship. I think like we talk a lot about leadership and how important it is, but I think a lot of times membership, you can't have leadership without membership.
Yeah.
So
And that's a cool thing about the scale is it's perfectly symmetrical. It's just asked with the referent being your follower. If you're a leader doing it, so you can flip the study and it's would your follower bail you out if you were in trouble? So it's exactly the same survey scale, but leader follower is just switched out. That's an interesting point.
But I know, I totally agree. I think there is definitely opportunities for us to all be great followers, right? I mean, if your advisor or some of your fellow students, it's called the Leader Membership Exchange because we want to have positive things going both directions, and you can't have a good exchange unless both people are active. So very good point. Any other thoughts, questions?
I thought it was interesting how it said in the discussion that LMX was directly and positively related to job satisfaction, but not to commitment to the organization. And so as a leader, that kind of makes me like, I'm putting in all this effort to kind of help them out and that, but that's not, I'm not getting a repayment of commitment from them on their end. They may enjoy their job more, but it didn't show anything to that, so.
And that is through the structural equation model that it didn't have a direct
Okay.
effect. And too bad Dr. Zhao isn't here, but there was a meaningfully sized correlation between LMX and commitment. It was like 0.37.
But
So the theory we impose on the data through the model, it didn't have a direct relationship there. And there's a lot going on, and I'm not trained in SEM, but when you get to biostats 2, ask Dr. Zhao.
I have very similar thoughts, Jordan, because when I showed that correlation table at the beginning, there was a lot of very significant correlations. But then after applying that model, there was some differences there. And I also am not versed on that at all. So it'd be a great conversation to have with Dr. Zhao.
Yeah.
You got a question, Julia?
It was kind of just related to that, but anecdotally, like for me at least, I see my relationship with a leader as separate from my relationship with the organization that they lead me through kind of thing. So I think it's possible to have like strong loyalty or like feel very familiar with a leader and be super disenfranchised with the organization you work for, or vice versa. You can be like, I really care about this organization and the work we do, but I don't feel cared for by my leader or whatever. And so I think definitely the model has some input, but anecdotally, I could also see those two things being decoupled.
Well, and we should mention too, that even with the model, it's indirectly related to affective organizational commitment by increasing employee autonomy. So the model is arguing that there's a mechanism so you are influencing people's competence, autonomy, relatedness, and then that's influencing the other outcome. So it isn't that it has no relationship. It's kind of the model's arguing that it's mediated. Yeah.
And that's getting kind of deeper into the SEM as well. It is able to account for both those direct and indirect effects at the same time. How it does that, still not exactly sure on it. It's a pretty complex model, but that's the reason that they still show those correlations in some of those other tables. And there's some of the nitty-grittiness is still the results of the discussion. Yes.
I'm sorry if I just didn't retain this from the beginning, but what is autonomous motivation? It seems like there are some very strong correlations associated with that one.
Yes, so for the purpose of this study, the authors described it as the intrinsic and the identified. I'll go back to the intrinsic and identified. So what they're saying is autonomous motivation is your feelings and abilities towards making your own actions. And then some of the reasoning behind that is either you enjoy it, so that's why, I'm choosing to do this thing because I enjoy it, versus I'm choosing to do this thing because it has value and will be good for me, in essence. So within the workplace, that autonomous motivation, that autonomous motivation is kind of a blanket term for the study, is a sense of choice, but it really is looking at both the identified and intrinsic motivation, those two things being combined together. So kind of an overarching, do I feel like I either am choosing to do what I like because I enjoy it or because it's good for the organization and for the values that I hold. Does that make sense? I know that's part of the reason why they used SEM models, because it is a little bit difficult to capture what somebody's motivation is, and so it's a little bit more of a fuzzy relationship that you could say.
I think it's a little bit more clear. So with autonomous motivation, I mean, autonomous makes me think of like coming from yourself, and then motivation is like the reason why you do things. So is it that the reason why you do things at work comes from like within yourself as opposed to like external factors?
Yeah, so my understanding is the higher you get up on the scale, you feel like you have control over the things that are happening versus per se your leader or the organization controlling things for you.
Okay.
And I'm also not like super well versed in autonomous motivation. It's a lot of psychological principles like this can be pretty difficult to conceptualize. And so I would say in the article, I think they did an okay job of explaining it, but they mainly referred back to it being for the purposes of their study, the identified and intrinsic motivation.
Yeah,
Lauren, I believe you had a question as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, autonomy is usually in the range of choice and control at work. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation is its own kind of area, where extrinsic is external rewards, external incentives, where intrinsic is driven by mastery, engagement with the task, maybe your own values. But yeah, they're in the same ballpark, intrinsic motivation and autonomous motivation.
Lauren?
I was just curious if if there were any variables you felt like were missing from this model, if you could add any, or I guess even if you thought any should be taken out of the model. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question for a lot of reasons. Sorry, I know that's kind of like the crummy way to say, oh, that's a great question. But I feel like with one of the authors' things that they wanted to do was to have a broader understand or a broader outreach of outcomes. Because I do feel like they looked at job satisfaction as like the final or tertiary outcome. Job satisfaction, their vitality at work, and their commitment. If I was a organizational health professional working for a company, I feel like the company would be like, we want more like how many boxes did they put together type numbers on performance. So I do feel like having on that right-hand side of the model, whether that is some form of measure of performance like for that company. I also think it would be like, because I'm more of a psych background, I think it'd be really interesting to look at some of the different psychosocial things like their perceived support, maybe like their stress at work, their perceived stress, and those kinds of variables. I will also say with this model, it's been done in the past where your self-deterministic needs are measured by one scale as kind of like a whole view of the needs. And I thought it was interesting because they stated that they wanted to break it up so they could really look at those relationships. I feel like because we have seen it demonstrated, we could potentially condense those back into maybe one measure and then add something else that would be impacting people's feelings of choice for the future as well. And I don't exactly know what that would be right now, but I do think it would be interesting.
Thanks.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question or comment. Or not, unless Spencer, you got anything else? Same time, same place next week. We've got 2 more to go this semester, so we're almost halfway done.